Our last story was about Roman power. This is about what would replace it. I speak of the Christian world. Rome had done two things. It had created a material splendor, a material culture based on slavery, and it had pulled the resources of all of its empire in the service of the Roman center. When the empire based on the city-state of Rome declined and finally left Iberia, the claws were lifted, and the people in the cities and the countryside could breathe freely again. The value of the Roman Empire was a one-way street, as all empires are, and that rich material culture could only be realized through the destruction and abuse of society wherever the Roman legions and their mercenaries marched. Though the Romans had faced resistance from wherever they plundered, the most interesting resistance came from Judea, from the monotheistic Hebrews. The Romans could not assimilate them in the way they had in other pagan areas. The ideological culture was too strong. Religion is an expression of a society's self-conscience, and the Abrahamic religion reinforced the Jewish tribal identity. It was unassailable, so the only recourse was decimation. It would be the Hebrew Jesus, a man from Nazareth, who used strategies comparable to liberation movements throughout history. Jesus would use the ideology of the monotheistic Judaism and invoke the strategy of building the kingdom of heaven on earth. This is not a theological argument, but the man Jesus and his followers meant this in a literal, material way. Their movement appealed to the poor, the weak, the infirm, and the enslaved, those who toiled under the Roman Empire, by radicalizing the teachings that all were level and equal under a single, unapproachable God. A God who in the Abrahamic tradition had claimed, "I am that I am." The phrase, "a kingdom of heaven on earth," was accurate and succinct. It meant the immediate abolition of the Roman Empire. It was apocalyptic. And here's where the story goes off the rails. Jesus was killed by the Romans, in their common and brutal method of crucifixion. The historical figure was dead, and his followers fled and regrouped under the leadership of James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem. A totally separate and marginal figure who prosecuted the Christians named Paul began teaching and writing his own versions of Jesus' purpose. To start with, Paul had never met Jesus. It was 7 years after his death when Paul declared himself the 13th disciple. He was even bitter rivals and seen as a bizarre heretic by Jesus' successors. But Paul taught in pagan Greece, which James and the others, still Hebrews, confined themselves to the monotheistic world. A policy of live and let live was adopted. Paul independently claimed to have had a vision of Jesus visiting him, who told him an alternative story from what had happened. He said Jesus had been resurrected. He had obtained a new heavenly body that was waiting for everyone who praised him. Instead of a Jew, Jesus was the Son of God, a Christ who had risen from the dead after 3 days. Paul decided the water purification ritual of baptism didn't go far enough, and began baptizing people into Christ, saving them. He introduced the pagan Greek tradition of transubstantiation, which means to literally or symbolically eat one's own God. This horrified the followers of Jesus and led to outright hostility. Paul had created something without precedent in the Hebrew faith, and it was not compatible with being Jewish. A new religion had been born, based off this vision of Paul and the worshipping of a Christ figure. The remaining disciples of Jesus, including his brother James, continued the work of anti-Roman resistance from Jerusalem, which would culminate in the city rebelling again in the year 70, when it was totally destroyed by Rome. This decisively killed the movement of Jesus and his followers. The teachings of Jerusalem had been stymied. Paul, of course, died in a Roman dungeon long before this, but his writings, with his revision of events, lived on. They were adopted by Mark, a follower of Paul, who refined them further. These are the sources which were used when the Christian holy text, the Bible, was assembled in the 3rd century AD. Why were Paul's teachings used and not the Jerusalem apostles? This was a political choice. Paul's Christianity was sympathetic to Roman life and lifestyle. The Romans could adopt it, essentially. Where Jesus said to build the kingdom of heaven, Paul said it awaited you in death. The teachings of Jesus are very scantily even included in this Bible. What's prioritized is based off of Paul's hypothesis about a heaven and his narrative of Jesus' life, which of course was a personal revision, which he claimed was more important than the work of Jesus carried on by James and the other disciples. Earlier writings have been found by historians and archaeologists that peel back the curtain on this peculiar twist of history. The historical work Paul and Jesus by James Tabor, for example. It remains that the entire religion of Christianity comes not from the real teachings of Jesus, but from the dreamer, Paul. The work of Jesus had been a struggle on earth to build a real kingdom of heaven, with all people equal before the Hebrew God. Paul banished the freedom of people to the afterlife, where the faithful would receive new bodies and live higher than angels. The living world to Paul was an inconvenience, and a matter of waiting for an eternal bliss after death. In the meantime, the problems of the living world were to be endured and not challenged. It was also Paul who sold out the status of women, believing them to be the property of men. This remained a foundational problem of Christianity that scarred society forever after. This, the faith of Paul, rather than the radicalism of Jesus the Romans could use. The collapse of Rome happened for many systemic reasons, but it is true that the empire-wide adoption of the new Christianity undermined Rome's reason for being. No longer did people need the glory of Rome, but a local church and spiritual guidance. When we speak of society, it's important to note that despite the historical focus on feudalism and textbooks, the warrior society remained marginal at this time, being the weirdos who shut themselves away in castles. They were not part of society, but rather lived by violence and the patriarchal blood oath. The ideological culture of this world was very strong. The tradition of an equal people before one God continued to make itself known. St. Augustine saw all individuals and all people as a holy brotherhood of the heavenly city. All people of the world were equal and siblings. Augustine's implications rejected the claims of rulers and advocated for a clerical order. Movements of social freedom continue to draw from the radical egalitarianism hidden in the values of Christianity, the freedom and emancipation of people, whether or not it was adopted by the doctrinal power structure of the church. These ideas remained a contribution to the total liberation of humanity. The emphasis of a universal humanity and the high valuation for personality and the soul would haunt the church and lead to movements where the flock rose up against the church doctrine. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, a heretical sect from the 12 to 1400s, insisted that humanity was composed of the same divine substance as God, so no clerical mediation, and no limits on the self. If we are made of God, we must pursue our desires. The new religious world of placing the value on the soul and the spiritual reality meant a new and vibrant ideological culture flourished, one of the heart and immaterial values. The cathedral had replaced the agora as the center of social life.